Hey folks, I'm Tina Hui with Follow the Coin, and we're here with Andy Manoske.
Hi, my name is Andy Manoske. I'm a senior product manager here at Alien Vault Labs, a security company that focuses on defending your infrastructure in a way that doesn't require you to be a freaking security genius. I manage developments of our research lab, as well as emerging products in the company, and something called Open Threat Exchange, which is the world's largest collaborative threat sharing platform. Prior to working at Alien Vault, I was a venture capitalist for GPD Capital and focused on investments both in the United States and internationally in what I would call nerdy stuff. So infrastructure, security like Alien Vault, IT infrastructure, fintech, sort of like whatever is really complicated but has a pretty big impact.
So speaking of globally complicated fintech things that have a huge impact right now, you're also an advisor at Follow the Coin, and we're excited to kind of have somebody on board talking about what is happening in Greece right now.
Right.
What are your thoughts on how it developed and what could maybe shift? How did they get into such a big mess? I mean, I think a lot of times folks don't realize that sometimes there are other countries, the U.S. kind of takes it for granted, we're banked, right? And in some ways, it's very judiciously well banked, like organized, and there are insurances and all of these things. But what happens in a place like Greece, where now you're seeing that capital gain controls are actually coming in and being a really big problem?
Right. Absolutely. So to step back a little bit, it might be best to take a historical look at what's been happening in Greece. Greece's debt problems are not new. So about 6 years ago, 2009, 2010, there were a series of European sovereign debt crises that unfolded. What that means, when you get away from like all the polysyllabic words, is that there are a lot of countries that were part of the Eurozone that were not doing so well compared to some of the other countries, and took out a lot of big debts that they were unable to pay. Some of these countries, Spain, for example, is one of the big stable ones, have recovered and actually done pretty well and are kind of like on the path to making a really strong recovery and ultimately being really good countries economically as a consequence of leadership decisions they made, as well as just economic prosperity that's revisited those countries for a variety of different reasons. Greece has unfortunately struggled through a lot of that, and they didn't recover during that time. In around 2010, 2011, there was a recapitalization of all that Greek debt that happened. And what that basically means is that Greece, the country, owed a lot of people money from their bonds that they were unable to pay. And as a consequence of that, they started to near default and not being able to pay those bonds. So a few sort of what we call lenders of last resort, so these big people that would, are the last people to come in because you're quote unquote too big to fail, came in and swept up a lot of that debt. The two biggest of them were what's called the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Both guys, the International Monetary Fund, especially, was very popular for kind of emerging countries, as well as other countries that were not really emerging but are kind of on hard times and need someone else to kind of help them with their debt. So they consolidated that debt, but they still weren't able to pay. And as a consequence of this, Greece decided to implement some pretty significant, we call austerity measures, targeting aspects of the country's spending to hopefully reduce that spending and raise income to the government so they could begin to pay off their debts. That was wildly unpopular. And unfortunately, the recession that Greece was already in some ways, that sort of exacerbated it. Now, whether or not economics is a really politically charged topic, so whether or not you sit on one side of like the political spectrum or the other, this was something that needed to happen. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but the consequences of it were not so great. And the consequences of it were that the people of Greece were unprepared for those changes and rioted, and there was a lot of protest, and there was basically a huge political shuffle. So the new current Prime Minister of Greece who came in basically took a very different tone, which is that we've started near this point where that the debt capitalizations that happened, they need to start paying them off. And instead of immediately deciding to pay them off, or take a different deal where they could delay the time where they start to pay them off even more, he put it to a referendum in the country on whether or not they want to reject sort of what the deal is on the table. And the country came back and told them they wanted to reject that deal.
Right.
So now people are starting to get very concerned because if Greece defaults on this debt, this is sort of like this is a pretty scary situation because there's no one else that's going to like pay them money to help them get out of this kind of. They've sort of hit rock bottom at this point. So if you can't pay out the people that helped you try to prop you up from rock bottom, that's kind of the ball game in terms of economics. And there's ways out of this that people have talked about, but right now it's difficult to see sort of a situation where they are able to still stay in the Eurozone and be an EU country while being able to deal with this problem in a traditional manner.
So can you see them getting out of the EU, I guess, pact?
I mean, that's sort of, so there's a really good example of this. There's a very famous economist named Paul Krugman. And Paul Krugman sides with a group of basically like economists called monetarists that are really all about like manipulating sort of the supply of money within the country to be able to have economic impact. This, just as an aside, these are the kind of like, monetarism was a big part of Milton Friedman, who's a very famous economist that everyone kind of knows now. And a big part of how the United States has helped, had like basically employed tools to deal with aspects of recession as well as the most recent recession, how we helped build ourselves out of it. So there's this idea that if Greece was able to employ the use of another currency, like the drachma, which is the original Greek currency, that they would have been able to employ monetarist techniques to be able to kind of raise public spending a little bit more, get more money back into the pockets of, individual people or people that might create value, and hopefully kickstart that economy out from the recession they've been in for like the last 6 or 7 years. But doing that requires them to manipulate the currency. And because the currency they're using is the euro, they can't do that. Right. The only people that can manipulate the euro is the EU. And the rest of the EU is not necessarily doing that bad, or at least they're not doing as bad as Greece. There's no incentive for them to say, hey, let's go kind of like break the glass and pull the alarm bell right now. And as a consequence of that, there's a lot of people out there that believe that the only way for Greece to at least take a monetarist angle on fixing this problem is to leave the EU, or at least basically leave the EU.
And then where would that leave Greece? And what would that What would that do to that country and their banks? I mean, wouldn't they kind of just possibly be in even more trouble?
In the short term, yes. What will have to happen from this angle is that, let's say that Greece leaves the EU. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to recreate their old currency, the drachma. And, some of the economists that are working with sort of the finance ministry of Greece, they're very smart. They're not dumb. What they're going to do is they're going to use these like monetarist techniques to basically increase any incentive for people to invest in aspects of the Greek economy. What I mean by that is a very real-world example. If Greece gets really cheap, right, really, really cheap, which is what will happen if they leave the EU and they go to the drachma, there's still a lot of value in Greece as a country. One of the biggest areas of value is in tourism.
Right.
Like Manoske and a lot of the rest of the islands in the Aegean, right? It's a very big tourist destination.
It's gorgeous.
Well, yeah, exactly. And now, think about this. Like, what happens, would you go, if you're thinking about whether or not you wanted to go either as a European citizen or as an American citizen, which means go party in Ibiza for, say, $15,000 for a week, or go to Mykonos for $2,000 for the same amount of time for the same quality of service.
I go to Mykonos.
Exactly. And that's how Greece wants to get out, or at least some people want Greece to get out of that debt. Is because if you kind of have that currency at a certain different value relative to their economy, it makes it cheaper for outside investment to come in.
Right.
Investments, either tourism or it's capital. So a really good example of this is if you look at, I travel to Spain pretty frequently. If you go to Barcelona's airport, one of the things that you see in the airport, there's a lot of ads in Chinese, which is pretty surprising, right?
But no, I've heard of this, but yeah.
Exactly.
It's interesting. Explain why it happens.
Exactly, yeah. And so it's the same thing in San Francisco. There's a very vibrant and powerful set of, like, I guess, mainland Chinese investors who are going out and buying up real estate everywhere. So that's outside capital investment. It's really powerfully helped the Spanish economy, and that could be a really powerful aid to the Greek economy too. Especially if these people are paying a significant amount of property taxes, because that's how you start to recapitalize the Greek government, and that's how they can start paying back some of their debts. So the idea there is that, maybe in the medium to longer term, leaving the euro isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the problem is that there's that short-term time of incredible pain that you got to get over, and the question is, can you get over it?
Well, and some people are also suggesting other things such as bringing in like Bitcoin, right? And having that be kind of a neutral party thing that's maybe some of the merchants and consumers can actually sit here and sort of use as kind of a hedge or as a currency until their currency kind of corrects itself. Because right now commodities are going to be super expensive over there. I don't even want to think about it. And it's funny, everyone's focal point is on Greece because everybody knows Greece and travels there and like hangs out there. But if you take a step back, you can understand that this is happening in other places in the world like Africa and Argentina and Latin America as well. So, but I mean, one big history lesson, I think I studied Latin American history. And I remember them saying if you, like Brazil, for instance, and Argentina used to be kind of like the Paris and U.S. of the world, right? Like they were the superpower. And then they borrowed and got too much investment and never really actually stayed here and worked on getting their citizens a bunch of necessarily jobs or getting the right education in lieu of everything as well, and in empowering citizens to actually create a GDP that works. And then suddenly, I mean, it's a U.S. problem as well. For a while, I believe in like the 2000s, we weren't sure if we could pick up from the recession that we had during the bubble because, jobs seemed to be obsolete stateside, and then we were exporting jobs, right? Exporting jobs and then importing goods, and then not really like, there's no reason for people to actually make money in the U.S. until this new tech boom. So, I mean, what about really big long-term, I guess, solutions to take a look at? And where do you think Bitcoin comes in? Would it be feasible to use Bitcoin in the short term, or is that kind of just not necessary, or would it be challenging?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you talked about that's really important there is the role of Bitcoin as a hedge. So Bitcoin as a hedge makes a lot of sense in this kind of situation. If I'm a Greek citizen, I'm not going to be able to access, there's capital controls that are in place right now where I can only withdraw like 60 euro, 120 bucks or so. Well, actually, now a lot less than 120 bucks, like 111 or so, at any given day. And I can only access a certain amount of my reservoirs of cash.
Which is pretty crazy. I mean, what if you didn't have reservoir cash at home, right? And then suddenly now, how do you pay your rent?
You don't. And that's the problem, is that capital controls, again, the economics is a science. It's not, when we think about these as economists, we don't really think about them in terms of like, good or bad. We just think about them as different types of consequences. Where politics comes into play and why this is such a hard topic is because, it's one thing for me to say like, oh, the average like net worth or like the average like savings rate and all these other things will like, change per person. Reality is that, yeah, exactly what you're saying. Hey, I can't pay my rent on time. What's going to happen? I'm going to get kicked out of my house. In fact, that was a really big problem with a lot of Greece in the early 2012, late 2011, was because once the original austerity measures were put into place, there were a lot of public workers in Greece that had their salaries slashed or they were just simply laid off.
Which is part of what's happening right now.
Absolutely. And I mean, again, like, think about this from another angle. I can't take out like more than 60 euro each day to pay for my rent. My employer can't take out more than 60 euro to pay all of his employees.
Yeah.
So that's a really scary situation.
And then how does everybody get paid and eat, right?
Yeah. And that's, so basically right now, unless this starts to, things could get pretty bad. The question is whether or not Bitcoin solves a lot of these problems. It doesn't. And the reason why it doesn't is because when we look at monetarism as a whole, all these techniques about sort of basically changing the value of money relative to other monies out there, other types of like what we call asset classes, things I can buy to like hold wealth, that all requires me to manipulate the supply of that currency. And Bitcoin is the exact opposite of that. No one controls the supply of currency of Bitcoin. There is no one arbiter of that, of, sort of what Bitcoin is worth. Tells you what Bitcoin is worth.
Right.
And yeah, the problem is that, Bitcoin will be a great hedge of value for people's goods, potentially, if things get even worse than they are today. But it doesn't inherently solve the problem that the Greek government is poor and cannot pay back their debts. That has to be a structural change within their government to solve those long-term problems that you're talking about. And in the short term, they need money to be able to start paying off those debts. And you can do that by manipulating what money you're using and attracting outside investment or any number of different things. But unfortunately, Bitcoin is sort of not the panacea for everything in this situation.
So what is more of a realistic thing? I mean, because if you take a look at it, you could argue the U.S. is severely in debt. And so everyone sits here. There was a really great article recently that says, you think what's happening in Greece can't happen to you, but it could actually. And that's something frightening to think about. But, how can countries learn to be more self-sustaining and maybe healthier rather than sitting here getting into a whole heap of trouble where you can become the next Brazil or Mexico or Argentina, right? It can happen.
So all that question is a great question. It is literally the defining question for all of modern economics. All of modern economics.
Bingo!
Exactly. If you get that question, have I got a Nobel Prize for you? In all seriousness, though, when you look at all of modern economics, basically focuses on the Great Depression, and it focuses on the Great Depression because that was the time where everything went wrong. Literally everything that could go wrong went wrong. And so we want to study economics largely in an applied sense to be able to learn from those lessons and never do it again.
Right.
And so Greece is sort of, there's things we can take away from, how we'll eventually resolve this conflict. But the long-term problems of Greece, is actually, the answers there come from the success of other countries that have faced similar issues. A great example of that is, and this is not even related to technology whatsoever, it's pure economics, is South Korea. So South Korea is one of the the huge, they call them the East Asian tigers. Basically, South Korea, China, Japan. When you look at these countries in 1960 and 1970, these were not countries that were doing very well economically.
Right.
China was, very, very communist at that time. South Korea had just finished the Korean War and was dealing with a lot of political turmoil that they kept dealing with for another 30 years. And Japan was recovering from World War II. The country had effectively been destroyed. So how they rebuilt their economies and became sort of really powerhouse engines of economic power over 40, 50 years is a very complex area of study, but it basically boils down to they invested in the people. South Korea in particular is a very interesting case because the situation of South Korea was, it wasn't as bad as Japan, where they had to completely rebuild their entire capital infrastructure. I mean, they did after the Korean War, but it wasn't on the same kind of scale that Japan had to do. And similarly, it wasn't like China, where China just had a massive amount of raw, natural goods, but they just didn't have an economic system that was good at exporting those and had to be opened up. South Korea just was basically kind of dealing with sort of smaller versions of both those problems and said, all right, listen, let's just go out there and try to sell this country as a viable place to be traded with. South Korea as a whole, like Greece, doesn't have a lot of domestic resources.
Right.
Greece actually has a lot more domestic resources in terms of agriculture, but a lot of their power came from goods and services, tourism, for example. So as a consequence of that, they looked for ways to not only invest in the quality of their people, both in terms of education, both in terms of the basically building up a subsequent generation of people who would be smart, capable, and valuable as workers across the world. They also spent a lot of time looking for ways that, and this is something that entrepreneurs do and tech CEOs do all the time, or just CEOs of any country in general, or company in general. They looked for inflection points where they could capitalize on change.
Right.
And South Korea's big one was telecom and tech. And so what Greece probably needs to do is first they just got to figure out how they're going to be able to start paying off some of their debtors, or their creditors rather. And they need to figure out ways they can, like, in the medium term, be able to sustainably continue as a government without kind of like dwindling back into the chaos that came during 2011 and 2012, or chaos that will be much worse as a consequence of not having just any currency available to their people.
Well, I was just on a call earlier, and they said maybe they're, in some places we can't really know for sure because sometimes media over exaggerates and sometimes it's actually worse. And so it's kind of interesting. They were like, well, maybe in some places they're back to barter, like I'll pay my rent with, fish or something. So.
Well, you're exactly right. And that's where Bitcoin actually can be valuable. It can be valuable as we talked about, a currency of hedge. This is the perfect time for you to pull on that currency of hedge. Like if all else fails, there's always gold, there's always silver, etc. The real concern.
Go on. Your real concern.
I mean, the real concern, though, is that we can talk about like sort of the medium and longer term ways that Greece can avoid sort of the woes of like what we call contagion, which is like where their economic problem spreads and causes a lot of problems elsewhere and screws them over even more. But the reality is that like Greece just needs to figure out those short and medium term problems, just because if they don't do that well, there may not be a Greek government to fix some tall problems. Like there's this concept in political science called the Guns of August, and it comes from this book about World War One. Prior to World War One, the world, like in the late 19th century, early 20th century, most of the major superpowers in the world were actually on very amicable terms. I mean, this is like 10 years, 5 years even, before like all-out war breaks out for the first time across the world. These people all went to the English king at the time died, and everyone that would be eventually killed, like fighting each other on different sides of the, different sides of World War One, all showed up at this funeral, and they're all amicable towards each other. And the reason why everyone was friendly was because trade was going on. People were making money. When people stop making money, and when they start running into hardship they cannot overcome through economic means, the Guns of August kicks in, and then people start making rash decisions. Like, for example, if you can't eat, what are you going to do? Well, I can go out and barter. I can use Bitcoin to do that. More likely, if things are really bad, I'm going to go get a sharp object, and I'm going to stab someone, and I'm going to get food. Right. And that's crazy, but that has happened a lot throughout human history.
Dire straits, right? People do dire things in those times where you need to feed your family, your baby's sick, whatever, and then you kind of do whatever it takes to take care of a need.
Exactly.
It's just human history. Unless, everybody could get together and really help each other out while everybody's in the dumps. But that's sort of a utopian, idealistic.
It's just, there's even, the whole, there's a lot of different nightmare scenarios with what could happen if things in Greece go really far south. But what's scary is that even when things like recover, there's been times where economies have recovered, but bad political decisions were made. The hallmark of that is 1930s Germany. So after the Great Depression, as they need to make war reparations, Germany suffered immensely. And certainly they figured out a way to recapitalize the country, to kickstart their economy in a certain really horrible way, and effectively start producing capital goods. On paper, that all seemed great. But what happened was they got the Nazis in power, and suffice to say,
we all know how bad that went. Yes.
Yeah, so it's you got to be really careful with this kind of stuff. I think that the big thing here that everyone's waiting for from an economic point of view is Greece to come out with a plan to show that they're serious about this. Because right now, a lot of really powerful economic agents out there don't think they're very serious. The idea of voting for whether or not you're going to, whether or not you're going to accept debt deals is ridiculous, because the average Greek citizen has no background in the delicate measures of finance necessary to understand why you're doing this, much less what you're doing in the first place. So that was just purely seen by a lot of people as political meandering. And, ultimately, if everyone loses faith in Greece and Greece just has no money left, you can see some pretty bad stuff go on.
Well, and then this is a larger discussion as to whether or not, I mean, overall, okay, in the coast, you and I both live in the Bay Area, San Francisco. Then there's New York, and then there's, countries that are not as impacted, or even states. And if you think about it, the rest of the world, though, is kind of getting into a state of decline, right, economically. Like, there isn't that much, I mean, there's unemployment's high right now in most of the world, let's be honest. And people don't really, education is kind of, plateaued. And it's arguable that maybe we're all in a bunch of trouble because our countries were, running on debt. Everybody is sort of sitting here borrowing from each other. China is, I guess, rising as a superpower because they've got all the people and a lot of exportation going on. But I mean, what happens when the powers of economic shift? And what if it's not just Greece? What if multiple countries in the EU start failing as well?
So I think that you bring up a really good point, and I think that everyone forgets this. As American citizens, it's easy for us to kind of shut out the rest of the world and say that doesn't affect us here. It definitely affects us here. That's the whole point about like a global modern economy is that when a butterfly flaps its wings in Greece, a hurricane gets created in the United States. One of the cool things, though, I take a pretty positive view on global economics. There's a lot of chaos going on right now in certain parts of the world as they adjust to this more modern, globalized economy. But there's areas of the world that have done fantastically well and continue to improve as a consequence of just making good decisions and sort of dealing with things as opposed to running away from them. South Korea is a good example of that. Japan has had, their rocket ship growth in the 80s has slowed and ultimately was mired in a little bit of a recession of the contagion that happened in the late 80s or 90s. But they've been doing pretty well too. And China, of course, obviously is like the hallmark as well as all the BRICS that are not Russia. So they've done pretty well. The problem, though, and debt itself, by the way, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what debt is, right? Debt isn't necessarily a bad thing if you can pay it back. And that's the big thing, is that, taking on debt. Governments don't take on debt in the same way that we take on debt with a credit card or a car loan. They're selling instruments that require either payment at some date or payment immediately in small segments to finance big projects. So if you take on debt to do something good, and you can pay it back over that time, and ultimately that debt has a power, the capital that you've taken on is used in a way to improve your economy, it's by no means a bad thing. And a good example of good debt is, and people don't realize this, but it's actually the interplay between U.S. and China. So our economies now are so combined, linked together because of how we've both invested capital in each other's economies. And people forget, for example, the United States is the biggest consumer of China's goods. A lot of our private sector is heavily invested in China.
Basically, everything's made in China.
Basically, yeah. And so, it's really important that that alone has had a very good political impact on our relationship with China. I mean, even though you have concern about hacking and you have concern about China's growing role in East Asian affairs
or corruption.
Corruption is a huge problem in China, as well as other parts of the world. The relationship functionally between China and the U.S. is actually very good because of business. Going back to that whole thing, guns of August, things go bad when we are not trading with each other. But if we're trading with each other, things can go really well. And we can overcome sort of cultural boundaries that we otherwise would not be able to overcome. The problem, though, is that what we're really running out of is sort of means to fix big problems. What I mean by that is that this is a pretty complicated topic in economics, but there is this idea, going back to monetarism, of manipulating, you probably hear a lot about rates, like the Fed set a certain rate at some point, etc. What they're really talking about is real and nominal interest rates. And these ultimately have to do with how you set rates, how you set up different types of securities and sell them as a country, and then ultimately the resulting effect those have on how people lend money within your economy, and also people that are interacting with the economy lend money to your country, your companies, your citizens, etc. The rates for historically, the rates for the Fed, the United States, and a lot of other central banks abroad, especially China, have been astronomically low. And the reason why we've been doing that is because we've been trying to get out of a recession. It's been one of the worst, not one of the worst recessions since the Great Depression. So we've set rates low, which has effectively allowed the cost for basically borrowing money to go down a lot. That means the banks are lending out a lot more money. People are getting companies are getting a lot more money to hire people. People are getting more money in their pocket, and they're going out and buying houses, and they're buying goods, etc. It's a great way to shock the economy to go back up if you believe a lot in monetarism. The problem is that the rates now are so low by the Fed and by a lot of other central banks that some places have negative interest rates, which is
Bad.
weird. We'll just put it that way. It's really complicated. But, we've sort of kind of like exhausted a lot of our ability to shock the economy at this point. And so there's a lot of concern that, if another big dilemma comes up, that we're not going to have like the ability to lower interest rates to fall back on. The economy just won't respond at that point. It's gained accustomed to that shock. There's a certain limit where you can keep going. And that's a very big concern, not just for Greece, but for a lot of other aspects. I mean, even in Silicon Valley, one of the reasons why you've seen a massive inflation of valuations for startups is because there's a lot of other non-traditional venture capital investors coming in and leading rounds at astronomically high valuations because they can. Because they care more about the growth of their holdings in that startup, and not even just money, but like their growth percentage, than they do getting money out of that company. They don't even care if it ever sells in some cases, and that's pretty crazy because it's such a bad expectations, etc. The reason why they can do that is because, again, the cost of lending is low, and banks and other large institutions don't just lend money to people; they lend it to other funds, something that we call fund-to-fund transactions. So you have a lot more capital in general flying around, and when you have too much capital flying around, sometimes decisions that are questionable can be made. So, not even just Greece, if something happens to kind of destabilize the global economy in a particularly bad way, there's a lot of economists out there that are very concerned that we don't have sort of that ace in the hole in our back pocket to play anymore, and we just kind of got to take whatever comes at us.
And then, I mean, in really dire scenario, you'd have banks defaulting, just like they do in Greece, and basically not being able to give us any money. People running around with no money, not being able to pay rent, becoming homeless, and then maybe rampant poverty.
We have very strong defensive measures in the United States set up by the Fed and other organizations to be able to stop that situation. The United States is really, really economically strong, and it's so strong that like taking us out economically would require an astronomical effort. Either if you are a malicious state trying to do economic warfare on us, or if you are, just the economy, that invisible hand that's going out and causing mayhem. There's got to be a lot to take us all down in the same way as Greece. We have a lot of capital lying around that's like basically being saved to help us stave off those kind of situations. It's powerful enough that there's a reason why the dollar is universally accepted, or like many other currencies are pegged to us, because we are so powerful. But you're right. The problem is that regardless of how powerful you are related to the global economy. We as a country are related to what happens in Greece, especially if Greece stays in the Eurozone and they drag down the rest of Europe with them.
Right.
The biggest concern, at least I have personally, is the guns of August. If Greece's economic woes destabilize them so much that the government is forced out of power and just chaos ensues, there's a lot of political consequences for that have historically been very bad. You get, when people panic, they look to strong leaders. Sometimes those leaders are not good people.
Well, a lot of times, leaders are people who just are able to shout loudest and get the most people behind them.
That's exactly right. And so my biggest concern, at least for Greek citizens, is that, they're able to find the strength and positive leadership they need to make those hard, right decisions and ultimately right their economy. Because if they don't, and Greece falls into chaos and the nightmare scenario happens, it could not only destabilize Greece, it could destabilize the other countries around it, it could destabilize the EU. Stabilizes the EU. There's a lot of really important economies in there, Germany,
right.
etc. And so
France with Switzerland, and then there's the UK, and actually, I do actually have a bunch of relatives in Paris, watching the news all the time, and they say that a lot of people, especially from Greece, and a lot of other suffering countries, ones having challenges with their government and their banks, and just systems are already refuged into the United Kingdom and France and such, and Spain.
Exactly. Refugee
So,
crises are really a big issue. I mean, real world example with this. There was a time when Ukraine was a really powerful economy. During the late 80s and actually in the 70s, under the USSR, Ukraine was sort of the breadbasket for the USSR. And they were, I mean, they not only served to like export some of the gas that was coming from Russia, they also produced a lot of the wheat that came into the USSR and the rest of Europe. They produced a lot of like livestock, etc. So to see Ukraine, like there were a lot of really bad economic things to happen to move Ukraine to where they are right now. Ukraine's kind of like a nightmare scenario situation as well. But where is Ukraine at now? Well, now they are in a weird shadow war with another country that, like, well, if they really want to, take them out in a second. They have serious leadership problems in the country. They have like an active rebellion going on. It's carved the country not just like geographically, but politically down its center. I mean, that has caused a lot of chaos just because of their economy and just because of political issues that have been basically brought to the forefront because of economic calamity. We do not want that to happen in Greece. And that is why you have a lot of like 11th hour and sort of like 11:59 time like efforts by members of the EU to try to resolve the situation. They don't want to have another failed economy that comes out of place.
right. No, hopefully not. I mean, this has been a really good discussion about the pros and cons of what could happen. So thank you for being on the show.
Okay.
And, I mean, are there any other great takeaways that you want to leave us with before we close?
I think just the one thing that we have to remember as, when we think about things, a lot of the audience here works in high tech or is affiliated with high tech. It's really easy for us to like think in isolation. Even when we had the last recession, there was a delayed response for hitting high tech because at the time in 2007, 2008, there were a lot of really powerful startups that were coming into play, and people thought we were going to be approaching another 1999 big surge. So it's easy when other things happen around the world or far away to make it feel like that's not going to affect us. But we have to remember that it definitely affects us. It may not have the same impact right now, but I highly encourage anyone who's watching, stay aware, like read about this kind of stuff. Make your own personal concerted opinion on what these things are. And if you feel so inclined, to take action. Because at the end of the day, what happens in Greece now, 10 years from now, could directly affect the region tomorrow.
Right. And
tomorrow and 10 years.
Well, we got to think about long term. I think that's what's difficult in tech. We've both been in tech for some time. I think what we see a lot of is let's make a lot of short term fixes and things that make people's lives better in our immediate proximity, but not necessarily thinking long term as and grander to thinking about humanity and social impact and the rest of the world and what everything we do also trickles out. Right? It's kind of interesting to see effects of that, which we'll cover on the show as we go. But Greece is definitely something to look at, even though we think it might just be just one country, right?
Totally.
Well, thank you for being on the show. Kind of a more somber episode, but definitely very informative. So thank you so much for being a guest.
Thanks for having me, Sam. Great.
Bye for now, and we'll have you on the show again soon.
Okay.
Bye, Andy.